Welcome everybody. We are very happy and greatly honored to have with us Professor Carlos Steel, Emeritus Professor of Ancient and Byzantine Philosophy at the Institute of Philosophy of the University of Leuven, who will give a talk entitled "It is necessary that the good always has evil as its contrary, Proclus and Simplicius on Plato's Theaetetus 176a. So we all know Professor Steel. He has been the teacher of some of us, and some of us are his students, and some of us are students of his students, and so on. But as custom has it, I would like to say a few introductory words before giving him the floor. So to start with, I first met Professor Steel on the occasion of a seminar on Plutarch, the Middle Platonic philosopher, not Plutarch of Athens, in Leuven when I was a DEA student in Brussels. So my teacher in Brussels had already told me about his friend who could master the most difficult concepts in Proclus, and he said even Damascus. And I still remember that first meeting back in 2005, because I discovered that that great professor could also be very welcoming and friendly. But I hope that he does not remember, because at that time I was, I think, too young and too unphilosophical. So, as we all know, his research focuses on the Neoplatonic tradition from late antiquity to Marsilio Ficino and Nicolaus Cusanus. But he is also interested, of course, with a special emphasis on Proclus. But he is also interested in many other things, from Aristotle and Ptolemy to the scholastic tradition and Arabic philosophy, especially Averroes. He is well known for his critical edition of Proclus' commentary on Plato's Parmenides in OCT, but also for his many translations in the Ancient Commentators on Aristotle series, including of Pseudo-Simplicius' commentary on the Anima, but also Proclus on Providence, and 10 problems concerning Providence, and on the existence of evils, these two together with Jan op Sommer. Just a few titles of his books to give a glimpse of the width of his work. The Changing Self, a study on the soul in later Neoplatonism, Brussels 1978. That was the first book, I think. Maximus Confessor, Questiones ad Thalassium, with the translation of John Scott Erigena, Leuven 1980-1990 with Karl Lager. Averroes, La Béatitude de l'âme, Paris 2001 with Mark Jeffrey. Aristotle's Metaphysics Alpha in Symposium Aristotelicum, Oxford University Press 2013 with Oliver Primaveris edition. Ptolemy's Tetravivlos in the translation of William of Merbeke, Claudii Ptolemei Liber Judicialium, Leuven 2015 with Gudrun DM. And as we were saying, there are also works that are very innovative, very new, and not yet very well-known, Cosmas Alexandrinus, an introduction, a philosophical introduction to astrology, a Latin translation of a lost Greek Isagogy from the school of Olympiodorus in Alexandria, and concerning forthcoming work, there is a commentary on Euclid by Proclus, which is forthcoming by Vrin, together with Alain Lernoux, and Scholia in the third book, the Latin book of Philoponus de Anima, in the commentaria, in the Aristotelian commentaria series. And of course, he has been for a long time the director of the Aristoteles Latinus project in Leuven, and many other things. I think I'd rather stop here. Stop. And thank you, Professor Steel, Carlos, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you much, Irene, and thank you much, Pantelis, and all the other faces and names I see of friends and former students. The text I intend to comment on today is one of the most celebrated passages in Plato. It comes from the so-called digression in the Theaetetus. I will immediately share screen that you can have the text. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there. 176a, you have it in Greek and in the Latin, in the English translation. It comes from that digression in the Theaetetus, and you know, hearing Socrates' praise of the philosophical life, Theodore exclaimed, "O Socrates, if you could convince everyone of what you are saying, there would be more peace and fewer evils among humans." It's a wish we have every day when we follow the news. Every day it seems to be worse than the day before. That's the wish we all have. Oh, there would be more peace and fewer evils. But Socrates brings down Theaetetus' high exaltation in what he's saying. I quote, "But Theodore, evils cannot be destroyed because there must always be something opposite to the good, nor can they take place among the gods. Of necessity, they haunt moral nature and this region here." You see, and that's the central passage I will use in my presentation, "Hypenantion gartito agato ai enai ananke," and again, ex anankes. So the necessity of something that's contrary to the good, but as I will explain at the end, we should notice that in Greek, we have hypenantion, not enantion, but hypenantion, and that will be one of Proclus' main argument in his explanation. What's this necessity of evil? So Socrates brings down Theaetetus' exaltation, but this does not mean that we should resign and fall into pessimism. As Socrates then explains, it's up to us to become like the gods in a life of justice and piety. The Theaetetus passage is often quoted by ancient authors, but usually in arguments about the homoiosis to theo. In fact, that's the sequence that follows after this quotation, that we should try to escape from this mortal world and become similar to the gods by a life of virtue. So, whereas the question how evil can be the opposite of the good is not so often discussed by authors. There are some Christian authors who were scandalized by it because they thought that in Plato there is here a kind of anticipation of the horrible heresy of the Manichaeans. If you say that by necessity there must be an opposite of the good. So I did some research on what authors were really explaining and trying to make sense of this famous passage of Plato. And there are, I think, three, and three are not of the minor ones. First, there is Plotinus. And Plotinus, in the well-known treatise, Where Does Evil Come From? Ennead 1:6, treatise 51. In chapter 6, you will have a very long discussion and very, I think, a very sophisticated discussion about the question in what sense evil could be said to be the contrary of the good, and whether there can be a contrary of the good. And so it's one of the best parts of that famous treatise on where evil does come from. Well, that Plotinus treatise, the analysis of contrariety, has been fully examined by Domenico Meara, and I talk about it together with Jan Opsomer in our edition and in our translation of Proclus' book treatise on the existence of evil. Because in the existence of evil, there is a long chapter of criticism of Plotinus' view on the contrariety of evil. So that's the first author. The second author is Proclus. I will return at the end of my lecture, if I have time today, to Proclus, but most of what I have to say on Proclus is also in the book I published together with Jan Opsomer. And the third author, and that will be the main focus of my presentation today, is Simplicius. And yeah, Simplicius is, that text of Simplicius, to my surprise, is not often analyzed and discussed in the literature, although it's a very interesting text. And there is a reason why this text has found not so many readers among contemporary scholars. It's a section of the commentary on the De Cielo that only exists in Latin. So the Greek text of the first book, the last pages of the first book, have disappeared in the tradition of the Greek text, the manuscripts we still have. But thanks to William of Moorbeke, who made a full translation in Latin of the commentary on the De Cielo, we can still have the last section, but it's in Latin. So you know me, I made an attempt to make a Greek version of that lost text, starting from Moorbeke, and you will see some of the elements in my presentation. I was not the first to do that. In the Renaissance, there was a Greek scholar, a copyist, Andronicus, who made a full Greek translation of the Moorbeke translation, because at that time, the Greek text that still existed in the manuscript was not known to many. And so he made a full edition. He made a full translation of Moerbeke's Latin, and that Greek translation then became the first edition of Simplicius. Okay, enough on the codicology and philological questions. So why am I turning now to this text of Simplicius? Well, because in that text, Simplicius reacts to Alexander of Aphrodisias, as often in the De Cielo. Now, at the very end of the De Cielo, Alexander uses a reference to Plato's Theaetetus in his arguments about the possibility of a world to be destructible, non-destructible. And that's what I will do now with you, go and explain that text. So thanks to Simplicius, who gives long literal extracts, we have the conclusion of Alexander's commentary on Book 1 of De Cielo. I quote, Alexander, after the end of the exegesis of the book, again recalling the passage where Aristotle says, to claim that nothing prevents a generated being from becoming incorruptible, tries to contradict Plato. So Alexander, in this text, Alexander tries to contradict Plato using what he reads in Aristotle. With new arguments, Alexander takes up Aristotle's criticism of Plato, who claims in the Timaeus that a corporeal world, although by nature dissoluble and corruptible, continues to exist eternally through the goodness of the divine will. So that's the well-known position of Plato in the Timaeus. The world is by nature corruptible, dissolvable, the corporeal world, but will continue to exist thanks to the goodness of the divine will. Now, Alexander begins in his criticism of the position of Plato. Well, Plato, but not only Plato, he is also reacting most certainly against Atticus, the Platonist of the 2nd century, who defended and developed that vision of the Timaeus. So Alexander begins by distinguishing between different modes of being possible or impossible. If we say that a thing is impossible, that it's impossible for it to be or come to be so and so, this impossibility may be either contingent or necessarily. It's contingent if it might also be possible for the same thing in other circumstances to receive the contrary of its actual state. Things in which this impossibility is said to be of necessity, for example, indestructible, are incapable of coming to be the opposite, for example, destructible. What is impossible simpliciter cannot be made possible by any other cause, whereas what is contingently impossible to be something may change into the other contrary. For instance, if a cause preventing it of being so is removed. It's all abstract. Let's give a very simple example. The example comes from Alexander. If we say of a particular weight that it's impossible to lift it, this is impossible in a contingent way, because if it's possible for one man to lift it, it may not be so for another man who is stronger and who lift it. So the weight can therefore be lifted or not lifted. We cannot say that it's simpliciter impossible for it to be lifted. The case of what is simpliciter impossible, for example, that the diagonal is commensurable with the side of the square, is very different. This cannot be achieved in any way by any cause. And as Alexander says, it's impossible even for God. Even the God or God could not make the diagonal commensurable with the side of the square. So let us now apply this distinction. Let us see how the possibility to be corrupted belongs to the corporeal world. Is corruptibility a contingent possibility? If it's a contingent possibility, it will be possible for this world to be made incorruptible by a superior force. If, on the other hand, this impossibility belongs to the very nature of the corporeal, no divine force could make it incorruptible. Moreover, says Alexander, Plato himself accepts that not everything is possible for God. And here is how Alexander now concludes, according to Simplicius, who quotes it literally, concludes his argument. You have it in the handout, that's text number 2. It's a quotation of Alexander. Do the people who say these things, and the people who say these things are those who say that the world is by nature, by its very nature as a corporeal entity, destructible, but thanks to the intervention of the demiurge, it can be everlasting. Well, do those people who say these things say that everything is possible for God, or do they say that some things are impossible even for him? For if there were some things that were, according to these people, impossible for God, it's clear that they would be so in their own nature, so by their very nature, te fuse. But, and now it comes, it's ad hominem against the Platonists, but they do hold that some things are impossible even for God. And now comes the quotation from Theaetetus, for in saying, but evils cannot be destroyed, Theodorus, nor can these things take their place among the gods. Of necessity they haunt mortal nature and this region here. I put in my translation here Plato, but Plato is not named by Alexander. He says that the Platonist, and he is Plato here, he says that there is something such as to be impossible even for God. For if, so Alexander says, it were possible for him, what would he have preferred instead of it? But if things which are in their nature impossible So preferred instead of it, I checked again the Greek. I think maybe it would be better to translate simply, what would he have wanted more than that? Because it's ebulete. What would God have wanted more than that? Namely, to make a world without evil. But if things which are in their nature impossible are also impossible for the gods, and it's impossible in its nature for something destructible not to be destroyed, and the world is destructible, it will be impossible even for God that the world be not at some time destroyed. For if this impossibility were possible for him, why should he not have made each of the other generable and destructible things indestructible? For in each case, it's reasonable to suppose that the divine is without envy. Yeah, aftonos. The divine is all good and only wants the good to exist. If then it's impossible that evils are destroyed or annihilated, it seems it's because God cannot make the generated world other than what it is by its very nature. It's destructible, and even God cannot take away this property. He would have wished to have a world without evil. Alas, it's impossible, even for the demiurge. So the demiurge may have wanted, but he could not make the world other than the world is. Well, so that's, thanks to Simplicius, we have this conclusion of the Alexander's commentary on the first book of the De Caelo. But there is also a similar text, very interesting parallel among the Questiones of Alexander of Aphrodisias. And in particular, question 118, I quoted in the excellent translation and commentary of Bob Sharpless, that it would not be possible for the universe to be imperishable on account of God's will if it were perishable in its own nature. And that question of Alexander ends with the quotation of the Theaetetus. But there is less explanation as in the De Caelo of that quotation, but it comes at the very end of the argument, but the argument is similar. So this was Alexander's provocation. And it's very interesting for us because we see that before Plotinus, that Alexander already used the Theaetetus passage for a discussion about evil and the relation between the demiurge and evil. So that's, in a way, it's our first author using, and as we know, using this text. So Alexander's provocation, but Simplicius did not let him stop here. He counters him with a text in which Aristotle, at the end of the 8th book of the Physics, demonstrates the eternity of the celestial movement. I think you may know that is a very famous text at the end of the 8th book of the Physics. In a way, it's the main argument for the first mover, the divine mover, immobile mover of this cosmos. And the argument of Aristotle is that the heavenly sky is, by its very nature, because it's a corporeal nature, is limited, peperasmenon. Now, a limited body can only have a limited power of movement. If the sky is carried along in an eternal movement, it's not therefore by its own nature, but because of the infinite power which is directly and continually given to the heaven by the immobile divine cause. And Simplicius asks Alexander, I quote, "In what way does it differ from saying that the world, which is by its nature corruptible because it generated, will not be dissolved because it enjoys divine goodness directly and without mediation? Let us apply Alexander's distinction. How does the limitation of power belong to heaven? Is it contingently or by necessity? If it's by necessity that a limited body cannot have unlimited power, we will have to admit that it's an impossibility simpliciter, so that it will even be impossible for God to make a limited power unlimited. So Alexander's arguments against Plato and the Platonists is therefore, Simplicius thinks, also a good argument against Aristotle, because even Aristotle seems to accept that something that by its own nature is impossible, namely that a limited body could have an infinite motion, but that this limited body can still have an infinite motion thanks to the influence of the divine power. But what Aristotle is doing at the end of the 8th book of the Physics is not so far from what Plato is saying in his way in the Timaeus about the everlasting nature of the universe. So, so the distinction that, I'm sorry, so Alexander's argument is also an argument against Aristotle. Instead of opposing Aristotle to Plato, Simplicius says, we must try to understand that both share the same doctrine on the relationship between the corporeal world and its divine cause. The distinction that Alexander applies, contingent or simpliciter, contingent or by necessity, that distinction is too simplistic. In fact, if we consider the world as separate, absolutely separate from the divine cause, and try to understand the world without a reference to the divine cause, we fall into absurdities. And Plato shows that in his dialogue, in the Politicus, in the famous myth of the Politicus. If you try to understand the cosmos without a divine cause, you come to all kinds of absurdities about this world. So a world without a divine cause is just an abstraction. Now, the world is not only in its nature generated and limited, it also belongs to the nature of the world to be capable, epiteideos, of having an eternal, everlasting existence, which is granted to it by the demiurge. Granted to it by the demiurge, not contingently, not against his nature of the world. So you're not forcing the nature of the cosmos. The cosmos has in its very nature a receptivity to the influence of the divine cause, and that's something Aristotle shares with Plato. So it's not contingently me endichomenos, me de paraphysin, alanankaios kai kataphysin. So it's done by necessity, and still it's not forcing the world. It's kataphysin, anankaios kai kataphysin. So we cannot simply say that the world is corruptible by its own nature. Indeed, if we consider its total nature, it's not reduced to being limited and corruptible. To the structure, to the total structure of the world also belongs an ability to receive eternal existence and movement from the demiurge to whom it's directly linked. Simplicius thus, in a way, defends a third way. For Alexander, there were only two options. Either the destructibility is necessary and belongs to the nature of the universe, and then the demiurge would not intervene because that would go against the nature of the world, or the destructibility is contingent, and that would be no longer the nature of the world. So by his very subtle view on the total nature, he talks about holephysis. The holephysis of the world is not only its corporability and destructibility, but also it has inherently an epiteideiotes to be, in a way, taken to another level by the demiurge. We can return to that in the discussion. So finally, Simplicius returns to Alexander's remark that's impossible for God to abolish evil in the world. This is an interpretation which he finds unworthy of the seriousness, he talks about the spudaiotes, of the commentator he appreciates in a way. And that's text number 3. And it is, I think, unworthy of Alexander's seriousness to say that if it were possible for the God to destroy evil, he would have preferred nothing instead of it. and to say, why then has he not made each of the other generable and destructible things indestructible? For in each case, it's reasonable to suppose that the divine is without envy. You see, this is a literal quote of the text we read of Alexander. These are the words of a man who thinks that God's power is weaker than his will. And yet, what could hinder the power of God who produces the natures of all beings? So what shocks Simplicius is that Alexander underestimates God's power and even makes it inferior to his will. For he says, Alexander says, God would have wanted nothing so much as to abolish all evil. Alas, he did not have the power to do so, what he wanted so much. In fact, by creating the last degrees of beings, he had to give evil the opportunity to insinuate itself into beings. So, I quote again, these are the words of a man who thinks that God's power is weaker than his will. And by adopting such a view that it's impossible to abolish evil, Alexander runs the risk, and that's the next in that text, number 3, Alexander runs the risk of falling into the position of the Manichaeans. I read with you. If he had thought it to be good that there be no evil at all, why has he made room for evil to insinuate itself into beings by making the lowest of them, of all beings, the lowest of them of such a kind, such that evil could arise along with them? And I say these things against Alexander, who does not want to say that there are two principles of beings, but is persuaded to posit only one principle by Aristotle's insistence that the plurality of fluorus is not good in metaphysics lambda. So Simplicius knows that Alexander would never accept a dualistic metaphysics of two principles, but by accepting that there is something, the existence of evil, that's in a way is against God's power, or that God's power cannot make undone, in a way he implicitly seems to accept that evil is a principle independent of the first principle of the cosmos. So the two main criticisms: first, that God's power would be weaker than his will, whereas the fundamental principle of all Neoplatonists is that there is a full correspondence between the demiurge's willings and the demiurge's power. The dynastai and the boulestai are always together. So Simplicius also points out that Alexander quotes the passage on evil in the Theaetetus in a truncated form, omitting the proposition which completes the doctrine, namely, there will always by necessity be an opposite of the good. So what then is this necessity? It's not a force that prevents God from doing what he wants to do. If God cannot abolish evil, it's not because his power is weak, but it's because God does not want it. So that's in fact the strongest position, and the rest of my text will about that. So the claim of Simplicius is that God, in making the world with necessarily forms of evil in it, that's something God absolutely wanted to make in this way. It's not something that he could not prevent from happening. He wanted it. Why did he want a world with forms of evil in it? Because otherwise the world would not be the perfect world he would have wished to create. In a way, we have here in this text of Simplicius a wonderful anticipation of the famous doctrine you all know of Leibniz, of the best possible world. So in a way, the demiurge Simplicius talk about is a demiurge making the best possible world. And if all evil would be taken away from the world, it would no longer be the best possible world. Well, you will be surprised to hear that, but let's now see the argument. And the argument comes in text number 4 you have. if God had existed as far as the heaven in the progression of his activity, if God had not created this cosmos, but just God would just be the God of, let's say, of the intelligible world, evil would have had no entrance into beings. But since God exists as the fount of all goodness, he did not pass over that lowest goodness in the sublunary realm, where there is generation and destruction, and where not only the form, but also the privation of the form are necessarily produced, so that something contrarily opposed to the lowest good is generated, which is considered as its privation. If this were not the case, then the lowest thing opposite to it would not be good, nor would God be the cause of all goodness. Consequently, God will not wish evils to perish, since he would thus also wish the good opposed to them to perish, and he himself no longer be the cause of all goodness. This text requires some more explanation. Well, there is a contrary between evil and good, but as you see, there's a contrary on the level of the lowest good. That's the level of the world of generation and corruption. In the world of generation and corruption, you have by necessity that opposition. You could not have generation if there is no corruption. Okay, I should not spend much more time on that. Well, but if now you would take away the possibility of privation linked to corruption and generation, then you would take away the lowest level of the progression of God's creative activity in the prodos of God's the progression, the prodos of his energeia. Suppose we take away the inferior level, then the second level would no longer be the second, but would become the inferior level. If you take away the second level, well, the first level again would be the same, the last level. So it's the whole idea, in a way it starts with Plotinus, this idea of the necessarily progression of the prodos of the first, that Simplicius Essite. Now, suppose you have not forms of evil on that lowest level, then you would have not the goods opposed to that lower level. And then there would be forms of goodness that would disappear in the world. That's not yet clear. I hope it will be clear in the text that follows. Now, very interesting, the same argument as we have here in the Cielo is found elsewhere in Simplicius, in particular in his commentary on the Enchiridion, which I will discuss below. Simplicius shows that if generated and corruptible beings did not exist, the world would be imperfect because a significant part of beings would not have come into existence. This would be unworthy of divine goodness, which must produce not only the first and intermediate forms of goodness, but also the last. That the first classes, if they produce nothing after themselves, would themselves become like the last, is an argument that Simplicius took over from Proclus. You have it in the Malorum Subsistentia. But there is, and that's now the most important text, there is a final objection. The objection, I think, everybody still has. And that's text number 5 in the handout. But if somebody were to say, what is there to prevent that even these things are good and not evil? He would not realize that these goods would not be good. What's the objection? Well, you could say, yes, I accept that there must be levels and intermediates, and the first and the second and the third and the fourth, if you like that. Okay, there will be levels in the proodos of the universe, starting from the demiurge. Okay, but even if we accept the necessity of producing not only the first classes, but also the last, we might still ask, but what would prevent the last beings from also being good in their own way, even if it's an inferior form of goodness? And then Simplicius answers, well, because the objection does not understand that on his hypothesis, even things that are good at this lower level would cease to be good. Indeed, what would remain of human virtues, such as justice and temperance, if they were permanently stable states and could not risk falling into a state of deprivation? What would be health of a living organism if it could not be subject to disease? It's precisely in their precariousness, instability, and limitation that the human virtues display a beauty and perfection of their own, which cannot be found on the high level of the eternal and universal forms. All that we admire in human souls, their courage in the face of difficulties, their moderation in the relation to sensual pleasures, their justice, all that would disappear from the world if human souls were not always confronted with the risks of doing wrong, of making mistakes, of making bad choices. The whole world would be imperfect if it no longer contained the distinctive beauty of those final classes. And the upper classes themselves, as we have seen, would become the last in the procession of everything. So you see, Simplicius concludes how many evils the abolition of all evils would cause. If the Creator had really wanted this, to create a world where no evil could arise, the Creator would no longer be good. So it's, well, let's give an example that's not, of course, in Simplicius, we're talking about health. Or another very innocent example you all know. Well, it's now the spring, it's a time of the flowers. Sometimes you take the flowers in house, they stay 1 day, 2 days, it all depends, but usually not a long time. Okay, now it's much easier. You could have plastic flowers. And there are many shops now selling plastic flowers. It's easy, you can keep them for a long time, you can wash them. Okay, we always say, no, please give me the flowers that flourish and perish after a few days. So there is the beauty, a beauty inherent to perishable things, to corruptible things, the beauty of corruptible things. And now you can lament and say, why is there corruption? Yes, but because there is the possibility of corruption, there is the beauty of things that stay for a day, for more days, for a life, and it's the same with the beauty of human souls. The beauty of humans, the virtues of human souls is quite different from the virtues of the angels or the higher, the kretonagene, okay, we cannot compare. We are the inferior classes. The human souls are inferior, are not the divine souls. But the inferior class of souls have forms of beauty and goodness that are not to be found on other levels. And with all the examples I explained. So the fact that we display beauty in the precariousness, instability, and limitation of our life and of our corporeal life, with all the difficulties inherent to it, is something that if this had been taken away, we would have a plastic world, an intelligible world maybe, but not a world where there is real beauty. And that's the main argument of Simplicius. If God had made a world of such a kind that no form of corruption and so privation and evil were possible, well, there would be a loss of an extraordinary form of beauty, the form of beauty of this corporeal world. So that's text number 5. I think it's yes. But I will say that maybe in the discussion afterwards. You see, I have in my handout the Latin and the Greek there of this text. The Latin, well, that's our only source, is the Latin text, but there are many problems with the Latin text, because not the problems because Moerbeke was not a good translator, but because probably his manuscript already, his Greek manuscript, was difficult to read and had, and I made with difficulty a Greek retroversion of this text, but I had to introduce, particularly at the end, many corrections. I will come to those corrections And some are really interesting. Well, I can't avoid talking about. You see, at the very end, I read, so if the last class were excluded from the world, esset mundus imperfectus, this is okay. In Greek, kai o kosmos ateles, uketiton eschaton pepleromenos, non etiam extremis bonis completus, kai ta prota, ja, eschata, agata eschata, et prima bona extrema, and then there is something extremely difficult, et laboriosa perfecte. It took me a long time before I had a solution. Laboriosus, that's the Greek term corresponding to it, would be aponos, without ponos, apona, apona. And you see, I made apona agona. And I'm not doing it by my own invention. There is a very nice parallel in Simplicius in Enchiridion. And you see the Greek there. Inakai teleion topan utos apoteleste, kai ta prota ontas prota mene, kai me eschata, kai agona. You see that the first should not be agona. And then there is even more difficult, perfecte delicta. Delicta, that's I think a corruption in Latin from a term that corresponds to what's it? I put it here, delicta. Yeah, debilia. And debilia is used by Moorbeker often as a translation of adranes. Adranes, not effective, debilis, weak. So the translation, the Greek should be kai ta prota agata eskatai kai agano kai pantelos adrane tes hylles idukun andiafere meden. This goes perfectly. I think you can discuss it later. This Greek starting with, well, our only source again is the Latin here, and it's thanks to, well, with comparison with other texts that I made and this Greek version. Okay, but now back to philosophy before we end. So we have seen this objection, and there is a very interesting text in the commentary on Enchiridion that's a very nice parallel of what I explained in text number 5. You take number 6. Just as the health of the bodies of this world would not itself be health if it were not in the nature of those bodies to become ill. In other words, it would be a certain pure disposition, which is not the opposite of illness. And that pure disposition is that of the heavenly bodies. So it is with the virtues of human souls, temperance, justice, prudence, and their whole chorus, which would not exist if it were not in the nature of souls to become evil, but if they had angelic or divine virtues, and certainly not human ones. It's exactly parallel of the other text I come to text number 7. What's the conclusion? Well, there is still a prayer at the end where Simplicius expresses his hope that what he said in the first book on the demiurge would be acceptable to the demiurge, but I will not discuss that today. Also, that prayer only exists in Latin. So see, I come to the conclusion, see what a great and multiple cause of evils would be the loss of evils. Oh, it's the paradox. What a great and multiple cause of evils would be the loss of evils. And it's clear that if he, God, were to wish it not to exist, he would not, God, be good. But Plato rightly both understood this and conveyed it to later generations that evil must necessarily exist and arise adventitiously for the sake of the good. For what he says, it's perfectly clear that it would not have been good to make all of the generated and destructible things and the lower things of this world indestructible. So the indestructible character of the world is something, the destructible character of the world is something that as we have seen, makes it possible that there are forms of beauty that also otherwise would be excluded. So that's not the end of the text of Simplicius. It comes, as I said, a prayer to the demiurge at the end. But at the end, but I think it's maybe too late to expand my comment. We can also discuss it. But I just give you the text. I promised to say something, if I had time, on from Proclus, on how Proclus deals with the text of the Theaetetus on the contrariety of the good to evil. And well, you have the text here, and then I will give some comments on it, and then I will stop for having discussion. It seems to me that's also shown by Socrates in the Theaetetus. What is shown by Socrates in the Theaetetus? Well, according to Proclus, evil can never be opposed to the good if you take it as standing on the same ontological level. Evil can never exist on its own right. It has a kind of existence only insofar as it's adventitiously for the sake of the good, as it's parasiting, the famous paripostasis that comes later in the text, on the true being. Evil as such, absolute evil, a principle of evil, does not exist at all. Evil is always a plurality of particular evils. The evil does not exist. And that's very interesting. Proclus has no problem in talking about the good, the perfect. There's no problem in understanding what absolute good would be. But absolutely evil is unthinkable, because you would remove all forms of goodness. And if you remove all forms of goodness, you would also remove all forms of existence. You would have absolutely non-being. And that would be, and that for that reason, if you know, the title of that treatise is Peri Hypostasios ton kakon, not to kaku. There is never a discussion about the existence of evil. It's always a plural. Proclus is using. So evil is always a plurality of particular evils that are opposing particular forms of goodness. So there is no evil corresponding to the first principle as a absolute evil corresponding to, okay, that's when the first, what I have to say. So evil is always, if we talk about the contrariety of evil to good, it's always a relation between particular relative evils and corresponding forms of good. For that reason, evil cannot be identified with privation if privation implies total privation, as is the case with privation of the forms whereby a being is destroyed. When nothing of the positive disposition remains, nothing is left to oppose the corresponding disposition. A pure lack cannot have any force to oppose the disposition of which is the privation. For example, the evident example is you can only be ill as long as you have a minimum of health. At the moment the sickness, the illness is taking away all forms of, that would be the corruption of the living being, there would be no illness. Disease can only exist insofar as it parasites upon an organism that's still somehow functioning. So in that sense, all forms of evil can only exist insofar as they take from the good they are opposing force, existence. They exist because they are opposing the good, and in the opposition to the good they are opposing, they have a form of being. So the worst forms also in human virtues and vices only can exist insofar as they in a way parasite upon forms of a pure, an absolute vice would again be a kind of annihilation of the being itself. And that's why in the Theaetetus, Plato talks not about a contrary to the good, but a subcontrary, at up enantion. And let's finish with that last text of the handout. it seems to me that this is also shown by Socrates in the Theaetetus, to those who are capable of following him more or less, when he calls evil neither privation nor contrary to the good in Antion. For privation is not capable of producing anything, and has indeed no capacity at all, nor does the contrary of itself possess a power or activity. But Socrates calls evil a subcontrary, an hypomnemata, since in itself it's a privation indeed, though it's not an absolutely complete privation, but a privation that, together with a disposition and participating in the power and activity of this disposition, assumes the part of the contrary, and it's neither complete privation nor contrary to the good, but subcontrary to it. And to those who are accustomed to listen attentively to what he says, it's clear that parypostasis is what is really meant. So in the Theaetetus, in talking about hypomnemation, implicitly Plato anticipates the famous Neoplatonic doctrine of evil as a parypostasis. Well, maybe enough for having discussions.
Thank you very much for this uplifting talk. I think there is plenty of time for discussion. You can raise hands or use the chat box.
I see Anne, yeah.
Yes, Anne, please.
Yeah. Hello, Anne. Hello, Anne, yeah. Happy to see you.
Yes, yeah. Right, okay. So hopefully you can see me and hear me.
Yeah, yes, I can see you now.
Yes, good, great.
Yeah.
So thank you. That was really fascinating because I didn't know these Simplicius texts. It all seems, as you indicated at the end, to fit very well with the notion of parypostasis as you find it in Proclus. And I just wondered, I mean, I know that there's a passage of Simplicius' commentary on the categories where he uses the term parypostasis and seems to be saying that Iamblichus used that term. Do you find, well, this isn't just a question about terminology, but do you find the notion of parypostasis in the commentary on the De Caelo and the commentary on the Enchiridion?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And in the text, but I have to look up my own, in the Latin, yeah, that is at the end where he says, that evil comes in adventitiously.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. That's the same.
There you have it.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, adventitiously, okay. and you I know I'm looking what's it's in my Greek letter version. It's parypostasin, but okay. in Latin it's murbica ad nascentiam.
Right. Okay.
And could you repeat this, please? Sorry for interrupting. The Latin term is
ad nascentiam. This could also be prosphysin, but I think Murbica uses ad nascentiam in various translations for parypostasin. I checked in the translations of the Riapuscula. So it's parypostasin. Alakalos o Platon anankaion usan tentu kaku parypostasin diato agaton. So Plato thinks that the parypostasis of evil is needed, is necessary because of the good. Yeah, that's it. Yes, he Simplicius uses it. Thank you very much. Many times. Yeah,
great. Thank you.
As you know, it's Iamblichus probably who first used the term, although it's also used by the Stoics, but not.
Yes.
In connection with
yeah. No, it looks like it's Iamblichus who actually starts off the Neoplatonic use of that term. Yeah. Thank you.
Jonathan, please.
Hello, Carlos
Hey,
again.
Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. Really interesting. This small question, but this idea of a distinction between will and power that comes up in Alexander, and then of course Simplicius' response to it says no, they have to be, of course, it has to be together. It's an interesting line because it's also something that shows up in Gregory of Nyssa's Anaxagoron.
Exactly.
He has that line about God's will is made manifest in the power of sex, and his power is completed in the wise will. I've been curious about just where this, even the idea that there is a distinction comes up. Do you know much just about where Alexander thinks there could be this distinction, or in general, just, if there's some earlier basis for that, whether the Stoics or something?
Yeah. Well, I'm happy you mentioned Christian authors, because the discussion about God being capable to abolish evil, whether there's something impossible for God, this discussion, of course, is very, very frequent among Christian authors. And the reason is because in the Gospel, I've forgotten what passage exactly it said, for God nothing is impossible. Then for God nothing is impossible. So, of course, if you read then that there is something impossible for God, and you have all kind of arguments, what does that mean, that something is impossible? And now it's, I was surprised to see in the translation of the last section of the commentary of Simplicius I'm using here, it is in the commentator series, that I've forgotten who made the translation. Well, in the notes it said that he says, well, it's surprisingly Christian, the argument. But I don't think it's Christian. It's just this idea that you cannot subordinate God's power, God's will to God's power to God's will, or the opposite. So both are really concomitant. And this is something you have often in Plotinus, in Proclus all the time. So there's nothing specially Christian in it. That whatever God wants, he can do. But of course, then the argument is that God will not want impossible things. We humans, we sometimes want impossible things. So you have a whole argument, just even in David's prolegomena to the philosophy, a long discussion about in what sense God could do impossible things. So it was a lively subject also in the school of Alexandria. But what's said here is not particularly Christian, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. Yeah, I'm just wondering if even this question that there could be this distinction, if that comes up in earlier sources, whether if the Stoics particularly might be a source.
Yeah, but I know I know not so many texts where it's so strongly argued that God wanted a world with forms of evil in it. He did not want to abolish evil. That's a very strong claim. And so the only form of this claim, and no similar claim, is Leibniz. That if you would take away some forms of evil, it would no longer be the best possible world. Okay, but best possible is, of course, an idea that's not, that we could not use to talk about the universe of the Neoplatonists. But I think there are many other questions. I think John Dillon has a question. John?
Professor.
Hey.
Well, I do. A thought, anyway.
Yes.
I wanted to greet you.
Yeah, thank you.
I found the discussion remarkably interesting, because I'm just wrestling at the moment with Plotinus's arguments in Aeneid 6:8.
Oh.
Which we were reading in our reading group. Yeah. And it seems to me that, well, I mean, the things that he's arguing against is, A, that the one, or the good, or God, is constrained in any way, or one that the Ptolemeros Logos suggests that he's accidental, he doesn't want that, or that he is compelled. And he doesn't want either of those situations. Yeah. But he does accept, I think, and Simplicius' argument seems to show the same thing, that it's part of the essence of God to produce.
Yeah.
And of the one or the good. So once you admit that the one is productive, it then follows that it must be productive of something worse than itself, because it's the best. Can't produce anything better than itself, or anything as good as itself, because that wouldn't come out as anything. So it must produce what is worse. And this is the beginning of what you might call evil, I suppose, that there must be then this process of production which produces levels of reality down to matter, which is sort of the sort of ground zero of production, which is relatively evil, worse. And what Simplicius seems to be suggesting is that if you wish to abolish that or limit it even, you would be denying the essence of God, or you would be restricting God in some way. I mean, all this has to be...
You would reduce or narrow the goodness of God.
You would narrow the goodness.
Yeah.
I mean, Plotinus can get stroppy about matter from time to time, but basically, I mean, he would hold that it's just the least good, rather than anything positively evil, and it has to. The whole process of the universe has to end with or get as far as that, and so nothing really is absolutely evil. It's just that all possibilities have to be realized, I suppose, and they're not always convenient for us. So something like that seems to be what Simplicius seems to be suggesting, that if you moved to abolish evil, you would be diminishing God.
We have to abolish evil all the time, and to try to... Our whole human life is a fight against forms of evil around us, in us, etc. So this... of course, we have to do that. As Plato in the Theaetetus, when he said that you cannot abolish evil, it does not mean you have, and then you have to read what follows. Say that you have to lead a life where of virtue, etc. So not abolishing evil. Okay, but we agree on that. So but in the demiurge, the main point is that you cannot, if you would say, I will go in the procession so far that whatever, even if there is lower forms of existence, as long as there is no generation and corruption, you have not really evil in the way we experience it.
Yeah.
Because to be less, you could say the intellect is less than the one, and the soul is less than the intellect, but it's difficult to say that this would be a form of evil. Even Plotinus would not accept that, even if you talk about less. So but the problem is with the world of the sublunary world, the existence of a sublunary world. And that's where, in a way, evil in a strict sense starts to exist. Because evil is, and that we know also from Aristotle, it's linked to privation and forms of privation. If there are no forms of privation, and then the question is, what if if the divine demiurge created a world in such a way that there is no sublunary world? And then, well, we are happy to hear, because we are living in this and fighting in this and getting ill and in the sublunary world. And then to hear that the sublunary world has its own wonderful perfection. That's what I admire in this text, that somebody, you would not expect that from a Neoplatonic philosopher, to come up with this praise of the life in the sublunary world, that if you would take it away, then the whole richness of our life would disappear.
Yeah, still the best of all possible worlds, even though it's not.
Yeah, and that's not an easy theodicy of, let's say, all evils. No, the evils are terrible, but and they are terrible, and they are forceful insofar as they suck on the good and abuse it and misuse it, and okay, well. But it's the approach of Plotinus is very different also on the contrariety, because he in a way accepts that evil, absolute evil in matter is contrary to the good somehow.
Yeah.
Although he has long discussion on in what sense it could be contrary, but I think that's his last view, is that it's contrary.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I see
Harold?
Harold.
Yes.
Thanks very
Hello,
much.
Harold.
Thank you, Carlos. That was a splendid talk about a splendid passage. I just was reminded when in your response to Jonathan's question that you'd been saying something at the beginning of your paper about Alexander being the first to use this passage of Plato in a particular way before Plotinus. And I didn't catch what sort of particular way you were saying that he was the first to use it.
Yeah.
But certainly Philo in On.
Yes, Philo also quotes it. Yes,
actually quotes it, and
yes.
it's used in the kind of context that might have given the Christians food for thought later, might it not?
Mm.
The fact that you've got that passage there, but but I'm sure that Alexander is using it. Using the passage very differently, however.
Yeah. For Alexander, it's to show that for God there are things that are impossible for God. That God's power is not, in a way, not absolute. There are things.
Yes, of course. Yeah,
and that's very different.
Yeah.
So far there is no question. Maybe
No,
from
Pandeli.
Pantelis has a question that I thought about Simplicius.
Yes.
I like very much his reply to Alexander, that Alexander, in a way that Aristotle is doing the same thing at the end of Physics 8. I like that argument very much, but maybe you do not agree.
Well, I do. First of all, congratulations for this wonderful talk. And my question somehow relates to Harold's remark. I mean, this T2 of yours, I mean, the text, I mean, it is quite interesting that it is Alexander who brings in this passage from the Theaetetus. And I think that he's doing that in order, I mean, within this context of rivalry between schools in that time. And he brings in Theaetetus. And I think his argument is, well, that the Platonists are inconsistent, because they say, well, that there are things that are for God impossible, but at the same time, they claim that God is able to grant existence to the universe, to the sublunary universe, which would be, I mean, the most impressive thing to do. And in the end of this passage, he also refers tacitly to the Timaeus, where he says, well, that why is it that, well, the universe by nature can be destroyed, but God grants to it existence? Well, this is because he is good. God is good, and there is no envy to whom is good about anything. But, well, if this is true as the Timaeus, this is true that, well, there is no envy. There is no envy. So why is it, well, that he grants existence to the universe, but to other generated and corruptible things, he does not grant existence? I mean, for instance, with regard to human beings. So this is a wonderful passage from Alexander's commentary on Aristotle's Decalogue,
while he is commenting on a phrase by Aristotle, and he brings in the Platonists in order to show that they're inconsistent in their teaching, in their doctrine. And I think that this is within this context of rivalry.
Yeah, sure.
And
I think
it's not about only Theaetetus, it's also about the Timaeus.
Yeah, but the Timaeus reference is, I interpreted it in a different way, because it's, you know, what he is saying is that God he wanted nothing more than that. If he could have made the world without evil, he would have preferred it. So it's ebulete. That's what he wished most of all, ebulete. But he could not do it. Why couldn't he do it? Because it's something impossible. You could not have something what's destructible, non-destructible. That's impossible. And although God is without envy, so the fact that God is perfectly good should not be a problem, because God's goodness here there is in that, and that's what Simplicius then is replying. You see, there seems to be an opposing force. Although God is without envy, he cannot make the generable non-generable. I'm sorry, even if I'm in the, I would wish to, but cannot do impossible things. So the avtonos character of God cannot make him do impossible things.
I see, but I think, however, that the argument is somewhat different. I mean, it's the Timaeus reference is about, well, in God there is no envy.
Yeah.
So God only wants to create good things.
Yeah.
So this is why this bodily thing, which is the world, which is by nature distractible and corruptible, he makes it eternal because he's good. And then Alexander says, well, if this is true, why does God let us die? Why does he let us?
Yeah, yeah. That's the argument. Yeah. No, okay.
So there is
this
idea of
if he makes the whole world everlasting, why should we individuals in this world have a limited life and not?
Yes.
But yes, those are the other general understanding. Yes. So if you are really insist on the goodness of God, he should be good also. Yes, I agree.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or thoughts for the moment? If not, I do have two questions, if I may.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first one is about peripostasis.
Yeah.
So you may remember our discussion in Leuven about peripostasis in Porphyry's Sententia 44 on time and eternity. Porphyry coins the term peripostasis there, saying that the peripostases are united there. So I was wondering how you think we could translate peripostasis, not in Porphyry too, but the meaning is different in Porphyry, and it has become something different in Proclus. But I see that you keep the Greek, so I was wondering how we could translate it. This is number one. And number two, it is about text number 2, where Simplicius says that this is the word of a man who thinks that God's power is weaker than his will.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether this could also be an accusation against the Christians who thought that God could create and then rest and then second day and then have started creating and stop creating, as if his will were greater than his power. So that would perhaps be also a remark related to the controversy with Philoponus.
Yeah. Yeah, you could think of that, of Philoponus, but here it's Yeah, I have here the text in Latin and in Greek. It's ten to theodynamintes boulesios and diestra nomizontes. Yeah, so that's it. Yeah, you could, but that's not something you would address to Philoponus. Philoponus has a quite other view. I mean, the Christian Philoponus has a quite other view on the creation and on the relation between the demiurge and the cosmos, and in any way, it's here certainly against Alexander. So do you think that there is a double meaning, that it's also against?
I may be wrong, of course, but I thought this was Simplicius answering to Alexander, wasn't it?
Yeah, sure. It's against Alexander, answer to Alexander. And of course, the Christians would even stronger than Simplicius advocate the boulesis of the divine, that the creator, the will of the creator as the origin of everything. Whereas, so in the Christian idea of creation, the will of the creator is much stronger even than in the Neoplatonic view, where the question is, what is this boulesis of the demiurgos? That's something we could discuss whether, and it's a remarkable text because there are not so many texts where the boulesis are so much in, but it's also in Proclus often with boulesis. Okay, that's the first answer. My other question about the translation of parupostasis, I think we have to start with, well, even William Moerbeke had problems, and he has that adnascentia, and adnascentia is what grows besides, and that's why sometimes I use parasite, because parasite is also something that grows besides. But parasites, well, and it's the idea that evil, all forms of evil can only exist insofar as they somehow borrow, suck, whatever you use as term, take over the good they try to oppose. They are sitting upon the good they are opposing. And as long as there is a minimum of goodness, evil can exist. If they destroy goodness completely, then it's finished also with the evil opposing it. So I very much, that's why I said that thing is very important that for a Neoplaton, for Proclus, maybe not for Plotinus, but for Proclus, there is not one form of evil. There is not a problem of the evil or the absolute evil. There's never a discussion of absolute evil. It's always of forms, particular forms of evil opposed to particular forms of goodness. So no, I have no other translation than what I tried myself, and that was parasiting, standing, sitting upon, coming along, existing along. That would be the most closest translation, existing along with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. If I may, concerning the first question, my idea was that Simplicius could be saying something like, how is it possible that Alexander holds such a view, which would be worthy of those who say that God's power is weaker than his will? So in a way, this is not acceptable. And this would be a huge reproach if one takes into account the opposition, Simplicius' opposition with the Christians. But it also reminds me of fragment 51 of the commentary of Porphyry's commentary on the Timaeus in Proclus, where he says that true power, real powers act through their mere existence. So if the demiurge is a alethys dynami, then by existing, the demiurge creates. So that's an answer to Epicurus.
Yeah, but that's also what John Dillon already said, that in a way, if the creator is creating auto to einai, if the one then auto to einai, then the discussion about boulesis and dynamis in a way becomes less less important. Because what does that mean, auto to enai? And that I think that what John was saying about, is it compelled to, or is it forced to, is it
out of its nature.
So it's we should not read, that was I was trying to say, we should not read this text about boulesis and dynamis in this heavy theological debate among the Christians about what comes first. Is it a voluntarist God? It's certainly not a voluntarist God, but it's also not the God of Alexander. It's a quite different God, if I may say so. Yeah.
And concerning the second one, I was wondering about this Latin ad nascentia.
Yeah.
Was that? So the Greek, I mean, there is this expression which Aristotle uses somewhere, I don't remember where, paraphias tu ondos. So could ad nascentia be a translation of paripostasis inspired by paraphias tu ondos?
Well, I must say I had my doubts, because the Andronicus in his version, first Greek version, uses prosphusing as his Greek for the Murbekes ad nascentiam. But then I checked all the indices of the translations of Murbeke, and I could find that he often uses ad nascitur parifesteke, ad nascentiam paripostasis. So it's a double translation. He uses the two terms for paripostasis, because as you yourself and as I and as all of us, we are confused about how to translate this paripostasis. And ad nascitur, okay, this then you makes some sense. So it's, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Prosphusis is something that grows upon. That's not really the mean. Evil is not a prosphusis. Yeah, you could say in medical sense you can have. I hope we do not have it. A prosphusis, something growing together, or that would be done in the sense of ad nascentia. But it's really the only finding its existence in standing along or close or sitting upon parasiting, like parasite plants. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You've done a far better work than Andronicus, Carlos.
Well, I will send it to you. But I will never do the full De Cielo. And thanks, we discovered the Greek text. Yeah.
Yes, please. Salomon.
This is Salomon Hoffman.
Hello. Hi, thank you. My question is about the discussion on limitation of the power of God. It seems that in the Timus, the power of God is limited by necessity and arche. I wonder if there is some discussion in Alexander and Proclus about the question about the notion of an arche, of necessity, and maybe a connection with evil, between an arche and evil. Thank you.
Well, the connection with evil is already in the text of Plato, where I started with in the Theaetetus. We have 2 times ananke in that text, that it is a necessity that evil would come about in the mortal's region. Very important. Already Plato limits evil to the sublunary world. Yeah. So there you have, of course, you could have a question, that was a question already raised by John Dillon, on whether the divine creator is somehow forced or compelled to produce the world in a certain way. And there you could have, but they would not. You have also a long discussion in the medieval tradition, in all traditions, Arabic and medieval and Byzantine tradition, about whether God is somehow constrained by its own nature. But I don't think the Neoplatonists would use ananke for that. It's of course, there is no idea of that God would make the world out of an act of free will, whatever that would be, that he is not forced to. There is a certainness, but that's another discussion, the necessity of creation. Why the first, in a way, and this necessity of creation is linked to the understanding of what goodness means. Goodness can only be goodness if it's productive, if it's communicative, if it's... but that's again not an ananke, but again you could say is it not a necessity? And I'm not sure I'm answering all your questions. And then the other form necessity, and that's a strict necessity. There's a necessity on sublunary world. That's the world we are living in. That's the world of necessity. And the Neoplatonist will often use necessity almost as equivalent of fate, of fatality, of the imarmene. So that's the world of necessity is the sublunary world. But going with your question, you could talk about forms of being compelled, but I would not use, certainly Proclus would not use ananke for that.
But is it a discussion about the meaning of ananke in this document?
Sure.
The meaning.
Yeah, to be, yeah, but then the mean that's usually in the discussion with whether or not something depends on us, whether we are free agents or not, and then you have that discussion of ananke comes in usually. That's the main context usually, about whether, or as I said, in the relation also whether there's a form of imarmene, and in about the meaning of the term. I don't know what exactly you are being forced, being compelled. I think that's the meaning. Something that does not depend on free agents, but that's given with the structure of things and the fatality of that depends on that. Okay.
Okay, but is it the meaning for God also or not?
No, I would not. No, that's why I would not use it. Although there are some mythological traditions where there is a kind. I think there's a text where there is also ananke as a divine, and there's also the. But then we are again with mythological traditions where the ananke and the fatality is something that comes from the gods in a way. But I have no, as far as I see, I know no text in Proclus where ananke is used for God.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you. More questions or comments? If there are not, and if Professor Steel doesn't want to add anything, no. So let us thank him once more for this great talk and for all these answers and for the discussion. Thank you all for the discussion as well. And let us also renew our appointment for the 15th of May and Professor O'Meara's talk on the Plato's interpretation, on Plotinus' interpretation of Plato's cardinal virtues.
Mm.
So thank you, Professor Steel.
Thank
Carlos.
you, Irene, and thank all of you for
Thank you all.
and sharing. And you, thanks for seeing you, Anne and Pantelis and yeah.
So see you soon.